Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our webinar, Breaking the Language Barrier, Working with Bilingual Communities. Our speakers today are Evelyn Agnus, Jerry Tinoco, Stephanie Villegas, and Kristin Kate from the Rural Community Assistance Corporation. Next, please. Next slide, please.
I have changed the slide. I'm seeing under acknowledgement.
Okay, it has not. Sorry.
Okay, why is the audience view not changed?
My name is Lisa Fote, and I am with the Rural Community Assistance Partnership at our national office as we take care of some of these technical difficulties at the moment. We will move forward. This webinar today is sponsored by USDA. And just to go over some logistics before we get started, there will be certificates that will be issued at the end of the webinar. This does not mean that this has been approved for CECs, but some states will accept the certificate to issue those CECs. So please work with your state agencies in order to get that. Please add your questions in the question and/or the chat boxes in the side menu. We will take questions at the end, but please feel free to put them in there as we go through the webinar today, and then we will make sure to address them at the end. The slides will be available afterward as a PDF. Give it some time for it to load. Sometimes it can take about an hour or so in the go-to platform to be able to access those, but they will be available. And there is a survey at the end of the webinar that we would appreciate you completing, because your comments and opinions just only help us make these better in the future. Next slide, please. So first of all, we'd like to know how many people are attending at your location. And we'll give you a few seconds to answer this question. Okay. So almost everybody is on their own watching this today, but we do have a few that there are more than one who are attending the webinar virtually. So just to understand that one certificate is generated at the end of the session. So we just lost our slides, Kristin, just so you know. But there is a form that you can fill out so that we know that we can complete to help you get those CECs if you need it for more than one of you. Next slide, please. So now we're just trying to get an idea of who is joining us today. So if you could answer this question, if you're from a small utility, a large utility, regulatory agency, are you a technical assistance provider or other? And we'll give you a few seconds to complete this one as well. Well, it looks like we have a really good mix of people with us today. About half of us today are technical assistance providers, so welcome. But we do have a fair amount of regulatory agencies and small utilities. So again, thank you for joining us. It's always nice to know who we have on the other side of this. We have one more poll. So how many years of experience do you have? And if there are more than one of you in a room, just average out the years of experience between you and answer that accordingly. Okay, so again, it looks like we have a good mix. About a quarter of us have less than 2 years experience, but well more than half have more than 6 years of experience. So a good mix. And again, we appreciate you joining us today. So as some of you may be aware, we are the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. We have 6 regional partners as identified on the map. We provide technical assistance to small rural communities for a gamut of things, including water and wastewater issues. And today, as you can see, our speakers are from RCAC, which is our Western region partner. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned before, joining us today from RCAC are Stephanie Villegas, Jerry Tinoco, Evelyn Agnus, and Kristin Kate. And these are some faces to put with the voices. And with that, I will turn it over to Kristin. This is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, RCAP, for hosting us today. And thank you to all of our attendees joining us. I'm Kristin Kate. I'm a regional field manager for RCAC, and I'm located in Anchorage, Alaska. Today in our webinar, we will be focusing on working with bilingual communities, the emphasis there on with, and the topics we're going to cover are building trust with the community, why is trust important, and ways to build that trust. We will have several case studies to give you examples of what has worked well and some learning opportunities we've experienced. We will go over getting to know the community and then talk about applying lessons learned in this webinar to other work. And with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Stephanie and Jerry.
Thanks, Kristin. Can you advance to the next slide, please?
All right, everyone. So this is Jerry. Thank you all for being here. So I want to start off by saying why building trust with the community is so important. Building trust with the community will go a long way in achieving your project goals. So there's actually a saying with many folks here at RCAC that progress moves at the speed of trust. And if you really stop to think about it, it makes so much sense, right? If someone doesn't trust you or the work that you do, they will be less likely to be like an active participant in the project process. So it's very important that we know how to approach and work with all communities. In my experience, I like to keep these 3 points in mind. First things first, we must always remember that we are guests in the communities that we work in. As such, respect will go a long way. Respect is pretty much a universal language. Every community will appreciate if you approach them with respect, treat them as equals. So no matter where you're working, having that initial sense of respect will go a long way in establishing a good relationship. Second, I wanted to talk about cultural humility. I recently learned about this concept at a training that was actually provided by a Northern California tribal organization that we work with. And I felt like it was such a strong and relevant idea. Basically, working with different cultures is a matter of constant learning and being mindful that no group is a monolith, right? I'm sure most of us have heard of the concept of cultural competence, which makes it sound like knowing about a culture is some box that you can just check off, right? Like, oh, I read this book, I know everything there is to know. So what cultural humility teaches us is that we should approach each community with an open mind and not assume that we know everything there is to know, based on preconceived ideas or something you may have read before. Just keep an open mind, be humble, and just you might learn some new things about a community or a certain region, right? So in a similar vein, my last point to building trust is to realize that as outside guests, we are not the local experts. We bring a certain amount of expertise, but we don't live there, right? So we should be open to receiving input from the community as they are the local experts, and they know their current conditions and history the best. So incorporating their input will not only give you more local context to the local conditions, but also establish a better working relationship by creating this two-way street give and take dynamic, right? So it's going to be a joint effort in the project. Next slide, please. So why is establishing trust important? So as I've already mentioned before, building trust will have very tangible benefits to your work or projects in any given community. Establishing trust will lead to healthier working relationships. People who feel heard, who feel seen, who feel respected and involved are more likely to cooperate and reciprocate efforts, right? So if you're kind of just dominating the conversation, not taking them into mind, they're gonna feel like they're not being included, and they're gonna ostracize you from the process or from their community. They're not gonna feel like they're being welcomed or a part of the process. So, establishing that trust is really important. I also wanted to mention to not take things personally. The trust building process is very delicate. And sometimes communities may be defensive or apprehensive to work with people, perhaps due to previous experiences, right? Maybe someone in the past came into their community and exploited their experiences or their resources. Maybe they came in to do a story about them and they never saw anything out of it. So just be mindful that that may come up. Not to take it personally, just work through it and try to establish that rapport. So moving forward, I'd like to talk about a couple case studies. The next slide. This first example is actually in my hometown. If you go back one slide. Yeah. This first example is actually from my hometown in Arvin, California. So this is a predominantly Latino community. It's like a 96% Latino, right? So it's a very large Spanish-speaking population. So we had this program, Agua for All, which is trying to increase the access to safe drinking water by providing point-of-use filters, new fountains all around the schools and the parks and public places in Arvin. The funder was from out of town, up in the Bay Area. Arvin is located in the Central Valley. So a lot of their initial outreach and materials were in English. So we did not have many participants at local assemblies and events we would put on because it just wasn't accessible to a lot of the people. So we saw very little buy-in. We had water meters at fountains just to track usage, and we were seeing low numbers. And it wasn't until we adapted and started this Spanish outreach program with Spanish presentations, Spanish flyers, that we really started to notice a bigger turnout and more public buy-in. People started voicing their opinions. They started suggesting where we could add new locations, and that was a really great thing to see. That the local community was buying in because we made it approachable and available in a language that made sense to them. So we just had to humble down. It's like we had all this material all ready to go, but then we had to pivot and meet the needs of the local population. In case study number 2, one of the services that RCAC provides is a median household income survey, which is used to see if they qualify for state grants and state funding. So we get we get dispatched to several different communities all over the state with very different demographic makeups. So it's very important when we do these household income surveys that we do it in a way that is going to make sense for the local population. This is definitely one of the areas where cultural humility and learning how to approach the community and the leaders really goes a long way, because if you just go out there and start sending letters out and survey forms out in English, you might not receive the appropriate responses that you're expecting. So, especially during the portion, which is the door-to-door surveying, where we actually go to every household that hasn't turned in a survey, we go and try to get the responses in person. So knowing ahead of time what the specific needs are, we can send specific staff members that might have, the cultural awareness or background to be able to service those communities in a way that makes sense to them. So those are just a couple of examples that I've had in my experience where, humbling down and really learning and taking the local input paid great dividends in accomplishing our goals in these communities. So I'll pass it on over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, so continuing to talk about working communities, I wanted to talk about the importance of getting to know the community that you're working in. So learning about the history of the community that you're specifically working in really helps understand the needs of that particular community, and it has also shown that it creates rapport. By getting to know the community, we can really help identify the dynamics that already exist and what might be causing divisions between community members. Learning the history can also help understand the dynamics that exist within that particular community. There could be a long history of animosity between social groups that exist within the community. So even though you have identified a small rural community you're working with, there might be already some existing social groups, and there might be some gaps or some tension between those social groups within that particular community. By identifying that, it can help you identify the different relationships that exist, and also the need for multiple relationships to be developed, and communication may need to happen between the various groups. So typically when we work in rural communities, we try to identify, a community member that's going to be that lead, or that person that we're going to be able to communicate with. Usually we try to identify a community lead that's really going to move the projects forward, is going to keep up the communication, is going to help us set up meetings. However, when we do have, multiple social groups existing within a community, it can be really important to identify more than one, so that there's multiple people invited into that communication, and that there's that they have really a seat at the table, and they're part of the conversation, they're part of the project, and they're part of that development of that project. And we want to make sure we're getting everyone's input. We want to make sure everyone's expertise is taken into consideration and everyone's voice is heard. Next slide, please. So I also want to share a little bit about an experience I had, and this was actually some previous work that I had done at the time that I worked at a local food bank. And I thought it was relevant to what we were talking about today, so I wanted to share. So the work actually occurred in Dunnigan, California, and we were doing a food distribution there for residents. The community of Dunnigan itself is pretty small, and it's composed of a few amount of houses, but more it was made up of mobile home parks. And in Dunnigan specifically, there are two, and I've actually added them here on a map so you can see the distance between them. And they're actually divided by what we call I-5 here in California. So there were these two mobile home parks. Initially, we had the food distribution set up at Mobile Home Park A. Because it was a small community, we thought one was sufficient for the amount of people that were served there. And everything was working well when we set up the distribution. After some time, we began to receive complaints that residents from Mobile Home Park B were not being served, or were being made to feel uncomfortable. And really the complaints kind of spanned over different types of things, but we saw that they were all coming from residents that were from Mobile Home Park B. We followed up with the complaints. We visited the distribution site itself at Mobile Home Park A, talked with the community lead that was in charge of the food distribution, and ensured that everyone was welcome to attend the distribution, everyone was served, and that no one was being turned away. We still continue to receive complaints after several visits and talking with the community lead, and eventually we noticed that residents from Mobile Home Park B stopped attending the food distribution because they no longer felt comfortable and didn't really feel like anything was changing. And so what we identified as a need was actually going out to Mobile Home Park B and holding a meeting with the residents there to identify really what were the complaints stemming from. And what we learned was that there was really this big division between the two mobile home parks, and it all really came down to the language barrier. In the Mobile Home Park A, we know that primarily there were residents that spoke English, whereas in Mobile Home Park B, we had primarily residents that spoke Spanish. And so that language barrier was causing a lot of misunderstanding. There was no communication, and there was just built up animosity that had existed for many years prior even to us coming out to do the food distribution. And so what we learned from this particular case was that we needed to essentially have two distributions, even for this small community, because we wanted to make sure that all the residents felt comfortable hosting and receiving and attending the food distributions, and that ultimately everyone was served. And so that was a big lesson for us, is that, you know, we did need to learn ahead of time really the history, the needs of those communities, and really any barriers that already existed prior to us even coming to this community. Next slide, and I will pass it over to Evelyn.
Hello, my name is Evelyn in Yupik, and my English name is Evelyn. I'm currently in Wasilla, Alaska. Next slide. Building trust within the community. It's important to take time to introduce yourself, from where you're from and who your family is. If you're from the local state, such as Alaska and rural Alaska. It's also important to let people know in the community to know what your business is during your visit, and how long you intend to be in their hometown, and let them know that you're coming before you're going to their tribal community, because usually the workers let others within the community know, and their tribal leaders, who's coming and what their intent is to work at the community. And especially during the COVID pandemic, it's important to ask the tribe if you can travel to their communities, because there are protocols for travel, and also because they're located in rural Alaska, oftentimes their hospitals are like far away, and they have different rules from the state because they are their own governmental entity. Getting approval from their tribal chiefs or leaders to enter their community is important, to know that the guests are coming and what type of work is getting done. And know the community before you go. So it's important to also know like what percent of the village speaks English or in the Yupik language. And when you travel there, you might find what sounds to be broken English, but it's not broken English, because they have a value of speaking their native village or native speaking ability, and English is just a second language. Next slide. Building trust within the community. It's good to be kind to everyone. Some of the people you may find, they might have a lot of humor in them, but they're not meant to be mean. When an outsider comes into the community for an in-person training or any type of other work, oftentimes there'd be a lot of children curious to see a new person at their home and might be following you or the group, and asking a lot of questions and speaking to their friends in Yupik in between discussions. Some elders might also try to come to you to speak to you in Yupik and might have an interpreter with them to speak to you in English. And know what part of the region you're visiting, because some places in the region might have a higher percentage of people speaking English and others might be speaking in Yupik. It's also good to value each person when you're visiting, because in Yupik, when you're meeting people, Yupik means to be a real, genuine person. And that meaning itself is described as a person as genuine. You approve of them because you are honest, truthful, and sincere in the way that they live and in their relationship with people. Next slide. On this case study, we work with the village of Akiachuk, which is also known as Akiachok, which that is not too far from Bethel. A lot of the population there speak in Yupik. And during this travel, we were working with an environmental coordinator who spoke mostly in Yupik. And anytime I work with other Yupik speaking people, it's important to speak to them in Yupik if like I know how to speak in Yupik, and that's a respectful way. And learning about the community, it's important to know that these communities have people relying on subsistence way of life, hunting and fishing, and learn where they get their drinking water from, and learn how the community thrive. Besides, in rural Alaska, people don't really depend on grocery stores, which are mainly convenience stores. During this project, I was able to ask for permission to take photos of where they bring their solid waste to a class 3 online landfill, and also learn what their struggles are and where they want to have improvements environmentally. As soon as I arrived in person, I met their tribal administrator and met with some local elders who often stop by the tribal office, and introduced myself and let them know what scope of work I am there doing at their community and how long I intended to be there. Also met with their solid waste workers and asked them what type of work they do, such as like collecting solid waste within their community, and like what types of things they'd like to see improve at their communities. So this one would be like needing to do backhaul of their solid waste, hazardous waste, and getting new equipment to consolidate their landfill. Next slide. So the other work I did after leaving, it was good to follow up with the community to see what types of education and outreach they wanted to do. And the Department of Environmental Conservation asked me to translate materials from English into Yupik so they could be posted within their community, and Yupik speaking people can read what the messages are. And having photos is good because it's eye-catching, and also when I'm translating documents, I make sure that they are proofread by the community, because where I come from, my speaking dialect is different from other parts of Alaska. Next slide. Okay. And also at RCAC, it's important to have a partnership with other entities. I was able to contact the State of Alaska's Department of Environmental Conservation and ask what type of other work that can be addressed while I'm traveling there. And they asked me to meet with the water operator about the types of compliances they needed to do to get their water back into compliance, and made a checklist and made sure that I worked with the water operator and put a time slot on to see when I was able to meet with them. And when I did that, he was happy that I was able to speak in Yupik to him, so he understands more of what types of compliance they needed to work on. So meeting with people in Yupik when I'm able to speak in Yupik is good, especially for their understanding. Next slide. This is pretty much a close-up of what the words were at the prior slide, but when we think about printing out materials or flyers and posters within a tribe, we'd have to think about, like, if I was emailing a document to a rural community, their internet reception might be slow to open a PDF, and the tribal office might only have one printer. So it's good to ask if we're able to print out materials for them from a city and mail it to them. That way it could be a lot easier on the tribal part. And when I'm writing materials for the Bethel area, that at that region, a lot of people are bilingual speakers, readers, and writers like myself. So it's good to also have a document that is also in English, like next to the Yupik material. Next slide. Another case study we worked with was with the Village of Chivak. I was able to create a flyer and poster for them. Although I am a Yupik speaker, but the Village of Chivak is a Yupik population. Yupik and Yupik are two different languages, but they have similar dialects. So when I'm writing a flyer or poster for them, I write it in Yupik, and then when it's sent out, they make sure that they change some of those wordings from Yupik to Yupik. And sending an English version is good too, so if they don't know a certain word in Yupik, they could easily identify that and change it to Yupik. Next slide. During our trip to Chivak, I met with a couple of elders I found in the local community and invited those elders to attend the meeting and asked them to speak to the group, because the elders are most valued in tribal communities, and they are respected. So bringing their perspective into the community is important, and they know the people there within the community, and it just brings out the message more clear for them. And also I learned with some of the otter learning we did was the mind mapping, because not all the people that attend are good at speaking out in front of everyone, so they're able to write on the poster and be heard. So next slide. And when creating flyers or posters, it's good to have pictures so they could easily be identified about what the flyer is or what that educational outreach is before they start reading. And when traveling to a community, a tribal community, it's good to remember to be respectful, and you could bring things they could learn about, and also you could learn from them too. So that's a really good way to see that both you and the community are learning. Guyana, thank you. Next slide. Yeah.
Thank you, Evelyn. And hello again. We're going to wrap up with myself adding some other sort of ways you can translate these lessons to other work where there are differences beyond languages. And some of my thoughts here will be re-emphasizing some points that the previous speakers shared. So now that you've learned about these ideas and experiences, how can you apply these in other situations? So the work that you do across the country, it gives you many opportunities to work with communities that have a variety of other differences, maybe in addition to different languages spoken. So these topics here in our slide are some ideas to have you start thinking outside of your own experiences. When you're approaching a new community, you can begin to think about what are the various components of that community's culture, or perhaps they have multiple cultures, like in some of our examples. And so if you think about working with a rural community in comparison to a city, how is living in a rural community different than living in a city? And this is an opportunity for you to put some of your thoughts into the chat box, and our folks at RCAP will share those ideas. So I'll just give you a moment to think about this. The question again is, how is living in a rural community different than living in a city? And while you're thinking about that and typing in the chat, I know for some of us it can be difficult to come up with new ideas when someone else is speaking. So I try to give you plenty of silence.
Yes, and like Coy had just put in the chat to everyone, you can also send them as questions, and then we will read them out to our panelists as well. but while some of you are typing, one of the comments that Jerry had made early on was with the building trust in exploited communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your experience was with that and what the situation was as well?
Yeah, so, you know, a lot of these communities were established as, you know, at least here in the Central Valley in California, a lot of the small towns, this is such a huge agricultural, you know, center. So a lot of these towns were kind of founded around like a packing house or, you know, a distribution center or some sort of crop. So sometimes, you know, these manufacturers would just, or these agricultural companies would just up and leave and cease production there, and the town was kind of left to fend for itself. And, you know, developers would come in and like promise things, and then they would just never come through. So there's a lot of like unfinished infrastructure, housing developments that were just never built. So people will get, you know, a little bit wary to agree to work with people sometimes because of these over promised and under delivered examples in the past. So in my hometown, there's like a huge issue with the water, because there used to be a chemical production company, I guess, or facility, and they just ceased production and they just left, and they left all like these huge barrels of pesticides that over the years, you know, breached their containers, and they started spilling into the groundwater. So there was like a huge plume, and there was always like constant ideas on how to fix it, and it was never done. Like people would start, or people would come from, you know, LA and other big market or big media markets to do stories on the pollution, the Superfund site, and then they would just not do anything, or nothing would come about it. So there was like a lot of hesitation to work with folks. There's like countless examples like that all over.
Well, thank you for sharing those, because I think it does give it some context for our audience. And in the meantime, we have had some comments come in. Access to resources has been mentioned a few times, including capital, broadband, education, technical assistance. We've also had population density and dispersal, a legacy of redlining. And the last comment that I see here is more space, more freedom, usually more quiet and peaceful, but less services. Usually, though, not always.
Those are great, thank you. Those are items that I put in my notes here, hoping that some would have had experiences with already. And I like the latter comment that highlighted both the positive attributes, sort of the positive values and opportunities in a rural community compared to what one might find in a city where people are more densely located. Some others I would add, so one of the topics that was suggested, access to resources, that's definitely in my list, and that includes, for instance, the example given, educational opportunities, and in rural communities where broadband may not have reached homes and even schools yet, that can limit the educational opportunities, including for job training. Another related access issue is having the resources for sampling materials, so that if it's a drinking water utility, so that they have the consistent availability of the materials they need to conduct their samples, materials they need to keep the system running and maintained, like having enough filters on hand when they need to change them, and also distances from the laboratory where they have to turn in their water samples. That can be a challenge for keeping the temperature correct and keeping the security of the samples. So thank you everyone for those contributions. Our next topic in other differences that we may work with or we may find in working with communities are related to Indigenous communities. So that could be some of the examples that have been provided by Stephanie and Jerry and Evelyn, where perhaps it's a community that is established as Latino and predominantly speaking Spanish, or a tribal community where the traditional tribal language is the predominant language. So what kinds of things would you do before or when you start to meet with a community that is an Indigenous one? And go ahead and put that in the chat or the question box, and I'll give you some time for that. Okay, so while you're thinking about that or you're typing away, one example I want to have you consider is the process of how an Indigenous community begins a meeting. In some cases, there are communities where their meetings begin with a prayer by a tribal elder or the tribal council leader. They may also have a certain way that they want a meeting room arranged. We might be most familiar with having the room arranged sort of in classroom style, with a table at the front and the speakers sitting at that table, and then the audience or participants are seated in chairs in a sort of classroom style. Perhaps that community will have meetings with chairs in a circle, or with the tribal leaders on one side of a circle and participants on an opposite side, and that kind of thing. Did we have any comments come in?
We do. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to add too that in Latino communities, there could also be brought together by food. What I've experienced with working with Latino communities is that when getting people to attend meetings or encouraging them to is they'll bring food. So either it's sponsored by whoever's hosting the meeting, or a lot of the times it's really just a potluck, like an invitation for everyone to bring something. And I have found that that's really successful in bringing people to the meetings or to the conversations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's great. Yes.
That is a very good point. One of the comments that came in is, I try to listen and learn first. I'm intrigued with the uniqueness of the various cultures, but it is sometimes tricky to know when I'm perceived as really wanting to learn and being disrespectful. So I guess to kind of build on that, as some of you mentioned, that you live in the communities that you have worked or are working in. So how do you get your foot in the door? If obviously part of the building trust piece is getting to know them, how have you gotten your foot in the door to be able to start that process? And I think that it would be great for all the panelists to answer that.
Yeah,
Okay,
I can
go ahead.
kick us off a little bit. Yeah. So I think, for me, it's kind of varied and just depending on the setting that I'm working in or um, really the work that I'm doing. But I guess since I shared a little bit about my previous work at the food bank, the way that I kind of entered in was first connecting, I think, with the community lead where the food distribution was first occurring, introducing myself, saying I was with the food bank. But one of the things I learned was not just coming in as like the overseeing entity, right? Right, because the food bank was the one that put on these food distributions, funded them, but I didn't want to come in like an authoritative representative. And so I found that it was really helpful to engage and build that rapport by, uh, pulling up my sleeves and helping with the distribution itself. And so becoming integrated with the volunteers that were helping to distribute the food itself. And by being there, I felt that I could talk with some of the people who were going through the line. And that's kind of how we started to connect with the folks that spoke Spanish. And for me, I speak the language. And so I was able to, speak to them in their language, say good morning, how are you doing? And as they started to see me more frequently at the food distributions in as a volunteer and handing out food, it sort of took away that like barrier of I'm just coming and representing this overseeing entity, and like I'm here to connect really with the community at their level, and I'm not above them. And I think Jerry spoke to it a little bit, is that we're equals, right? It's I'm here because of all of you, and to really provide that service.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's really beautiful that to quote you, that you were there because of all of them. Your purpose was working with them and what their priorities are.
We also had another comment from the audience that as a TAP, I'm glad you made the point there are other cultural differences we may encounter other than language. My state is not very culturally diverse in rural areas, but I find that my experience living in rural Mexico has been helpful in preparing me for keeping an open mind and being a humble guest in the field. Great presentation. It should resonate with all of us.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you for sharing that.
And we do have another one. Always consider to plan ahead the meeting with a local to clarify the expectations on both sides. Talk about your expectation and listen to your contact regarding what the person considers appropriate to achieve your meeting goal.
Yes, that's great. That's really great, because a lot of times in our Western culture, our goals and objectives are often come before the relationships, and the work in a lot of senses seems to take priority over the community and their way of being. So by sort of flipping that and recognizing, while yes, they do want perhaps whatever service you're providing, they don't necessarily want it at the cost of how their culture prioritizes or their culture guides their way of living. And I did want to give an opportunity to Evelyn and Jerry to share, if you wanted to share an experience of how you were able to build that trust in a community that you were working with.
Yeah, so actually kind of echoing that last point, I think what works best for me is just being transparent and communicating with folks, as I mentioned in the presentation, we're not the local experts. So just, having that initial meeting with some of the locals beforehand to kind of get some input, you know, things you should know. And even if we have like a community meeting, I always try to get their perspective and like, oh, what's been going on? Like, what are some of the complaints, or what would you like to see be done? Because a lot of our projects out here, the way they're assigned to us is that they'll have like a process where a community or a water system will submit a TA request form. And in there, they'll have like what they're looking to get out of it. But sometimes it might not capture the whole thing. So when I get to the first like kickoff meeting or a community meeting, I ask them, you know, it's like, this is what we were told is going on and what they want to address with the project. Do you agree with that? Or is there something we should add? So just always like keeping them in the loop in the process, being transparent, and then just kind of matching energy, you know. I remember, so I myself am Mexican and I speak Spanish, but not, you know, like super formally, or you know, like I couldn't go to like a college in Mexico and get A's in on essays. But I was always self-conscious about that. And whenever I would work in like these small farm working communities, I would always kind of be hesitant to speak Spanish outright. And then I would share like, oh, my Spanish isn't the best. But then we were able to connect because I used to work in like picking grapes when I was growing up with my parents. So we have like this bond, and you know, my informal Spanish ended up being like a benefit really, because it made them feel more comfortable. It's like, oh, this, like, he knows what it's like out here, you know, like I was able to connect to them in by speaking Spanish in a way that was like more familiar. It's like, oh, you're not like some, you know, coastal elite coming out here telling us what to do. You're from here, you know, you're from the Central Valley. So something that I was self-conscious about ended up being something that worked for me.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. Evelyn, we just have a few or 2 minutes left, so not to put you on the spot, but if you want to share something, please do.
Okay. Yeah, so I grew up in a rural tribal village of Shafornik and Nightmead. So I was told by elders that anytime I visit a community that I'm not from, I'm always just like a guest. So it's just like when you first walk into someone's home, you kind of stand in front of the door and say hi to them and acquaint yourself. That's pretty much what it's like entering into a community, other tribal community, and let them know what you're there for, what your purpose is, and then yeah. So with my experience, I grew up with elders and teachers. Like I went to a bilingual school, and the elders often came into the school to tell us, you know, you could only speak in English when you're at work or at school, but at home you're speaking in Yupik, and that's just our traditional way.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Evelyn. And my example very quickly is a gravel road project in a village. The engineer had already designed the road and its location without much consultation with the community, and it was going to be going right through a berry patch. So when that was determined through consultation later, the location was redesigned to meet the priorities of the community. And with that, I will go to our last couple slides here.
Thank you so much. So before we close up, I just want to say thank you to our speakers. For those of you in the audience and our speakers as well, we do have a webinar next week on Tuesday, July 26th. If you go to that website on the slide, it's on trench and operator safety. So please register. It's at 1 o'clock Eastern time next Tuesday. So I'm doing the math on the other time zones, but 1 o'clock Eastern anyway. Next slide, please.
try in there.
Thank you. And again, I want to give special thanks to Evelyn, Kristin, Jerry, and Stephanie. I think that we are all so fortunate to have these people within our network and working across the country. I'm always humbled by the experience and knowledge of the people in the field who work on behalf of RCAP. And so much thanks to you guys for your time today and for sharing your stories and your experience. Much thanks to everybody in the audience. We appreciate that you've taken some time out of your day to join us on what I think is a really important conversation. So with that, everyone have a good day and appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.